have a full slate for you guys. And we're going to talk about coastal flood studies. And that's not something we have a lot of in Montana or that you will deal with a lot. We do have Flathead Lake, and there has been some run-up action on Flathead Lake. I haven't really checked the participant list a whole bunch to see who else is added on, but lots of times in boot camp, we have about 4 or 5 people from Utah on our class. And in Utah, they do have some designated coastal areas in Salt Lake for the Great Salt Lake and also for Utah Lake down there. The other reason for doing this is because if you are truly wanting to become a CFM, coastal is part of the exam. And they're working on revamping and revising that exam. And they're saying when you're studying for this exam, you should be looking at the FEMA 480 book, and you should be looking at NFIP 101. And so with that, I don't know if you guys have done that. I know when I took boot camp and I had other things going on with the 6 or 7 hats that I was wearing, I didn't take the time to look at 480 or get familiar. Or if you guys, I know some of you have been going out. I know Gary in Cascade County has been going out and using the NFIP 101. But I want to show you guys, in case you haven't, what information is out there and available to you when it comes to studying. And I think this coastal chapter is a good one for it. So with that, Tracy, they can all see my screen that says coastal flood studies?
Yep, correct? We can see it.
Awesome. All right. This is your FEMA 480 book, and this is straight from FEMA 480. So you'll see this, we're in chapter 3 down here at the bottom of the screen, chapter 3, page 20, coastal flood studies. It's talking about where we find coastal floods along the Atlantic Pacific Ocean, Gulf of Mexico, the Great Lakes, Caribbean Ocean. What are they caused by? Storm surge. That's the main thing. How are we measuring these? Well, we're measuring them with still water elevations. What's the important thing to remember that they're going to test you on? It has to do with wave action. All right. And I'm showing, sorry, scrolling a little too fast, showing you these 3 pages in the FEMA 480. And then we're going to jump over to NFIP, and they're going to go through it in a lot more detail, which is why I'm running through it fast. All right. But when we talk coastal, immediately that should be going through your head is what? A V zone. It is a V zone. So coastal, V. Then if we're going to add elevations, just like with riverine flood maps, what do we have? We have a VE zone. I always like AE, VE for elevation, right? They added you some elevations. This little page talks about more about the high hazard areas and that 3-foot wave height. Okay, the V in V zones stands for velocity wave action. Okay, so there's your 4, I guess it's 4 pages in the FEMA 480 that you guys can read through and get a little more background. I'm going to stop sharing this right where I want to be at 9:05. I'm going to stop sharing. And I'm going to jump over here. And I want to start. And I got the video sound on. So turn your volumes up. Can everybody now see the NFIP 101 coastal flooding?
We can see it.
Excellent. Do I have any questions so far? I've taken you to the FEMA 480 and what it has to say about coastal areas, but I really like what they do in this NFIP 101. And they are starting to rewrite the material telling you guys to study this. So with no further ado, I give you NFIP 101 coastal flooding studies.
Coastal floods come from sources such as the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, the Gulf of Mexico, and large lakes. This includes lakes such as the Great Lakes and the Great Salt Lake that are big enough to have large waves or that can be affected by storm surge. Coastal floods can be very dangerous because high waters are combined with the destructive forces of storm surge, waves, and erosion. Let's take a look at how to find the BFE in areas of coastal flooding, where waves and fast-moving water can cause extensive damage during the base flood event. On Flood County Firm Panel 40, there's an area on the coastline of the Atlantic Ocean. Let's look at coastal flood studies. For a coastal flood study, a storm surge analysis first provides still water elevations for the 1% annual chance flood event. However, this does not take into account all effects from waves coming ashore during a storm event. Therefore, a separate overland wave modeling analysis is needed, in addition to the storm surge analysis, to accurately develop coastal BFEs and define the special flood hazard area. The added effects of wave heights, wave setup, and wave run-up are analyzed. A wave is a ridge, deformation, or undulation of the water surface. Ocean waves are formed by wind, gravitation, earthquakes, and underwater landslides disturbing the water surface. Wave height is the vertical distance between wave crest, the highest point of each wave, and wave trough, the lowest point of each wave. Wave setup is the increase in the water level caused by waves breaking ashore during a storm event. Wave setup is affected by the height of the waves, the speed at which waves approach the shore, and the slope of the ground near the shore. Wave run-up is the maximum vertical extent of wave uprush on a beach or structure above the still water elevation level. It can be thought of simply as the rush of water that extends inland when waves come ashore. Coastal erosion, due to storms and the presence of coastal structures, such as seawalls, is taken into account when overland wave modeling is performed. Where applicable, primary frontal dunes are also considered when mapping V or VE zones. Here's a side view of a coastal transect, moving from offshore at the left up onto the inland areas on the right. In a flood study, wave heights are analyzed along several coastal transects, which are lines located along the coastal areas and oriented perpendicular to the shoreline. Different sources are used for the data, including topographic maps, bathymetry, which is underwater topography, beach profiles, aerial photos, and engineering judgment. The height of the waves, in addition to the modeled 100-year still water elevations, are used to calculate the BFE. As you move along the transect from offshore to onshore, you can see, as the wave heights get smaller and smaller, the base flood elevation gets nearer to the still water elevation line. Coastal high hazard areas, labeled as Zone VE on the firm, are areas where the computed wave heights for the 1% annual chance flood are 3 feet or more. Landward of this point, where the wave heights are computed as less than 3 feet, the remainder of the floodplain is Zone AE on the firm. While the wave forces in coastal A zones may be less severe than in V zones, there is still an increased risk from wind and wave action along the coastlines.
Okay, guys, I am gonna just really let you dissect that because he just threw a lot of stuff at you, and it's a lot of stuff that you'll get tested on too if you start to be a CFM. So did you guys catch that? Any questions? He's saying, see the still water elevation? You add the wave height to it, and that's how you're gonna get the BFE in a coastal zone. We all caught that, right? And as long as these wave heights are greater than 3 feet, that's the V zone. But as these waves run up and they get on land, they're going to lose their velocity, right? And they're going to start to get smaller. And when that transaction happens, it's going to convert over to an A zone when the wave heights are less than 3 feet. In riverine flooding, how do we measure some of those changes? Don't we call them cross sections? We call them cross sections. But in a V zone, they're called transects. Okay. And then we're going to talk about some more pretty important stuff, but that is the main basic to coastal flooding. Any questions? Okay, you guys are mesmerized. It's Friday.
Flood maps in coastal areas may include a line called the Limit of Moderate Wave Action, or LIMWA. The LIMWA is an informational line shown as a black line with black arrows. The LIMWA marks the inland limit of the coastal A zone, the part of the coastal SFHA where wave heights can be between 1.5 and 3 feet during a base flood event. Past events have shown that waves as small as 1.5 feet can cause foundation failure and structural damage to buildings, so building codes and standards reference this coastal A zone. Because of the higher risk of damage to homes and other structures from waves in the coastal A zone, FEMA encourages building to the stricter and more protective Zone VE standards to reduce the impacts of future flood and storm events. Click the button to view a short video that may help you better understand coastal flooding zone designations.
We're going to skip the
After
button.
you've seen the video, click Next to continue.
We're going to skip their video because we have our own video from our good friends in South Carolina to demonstrate some of this, and we'll get to that at the end.
The way the LIMWA is represented on a community's flood map can vary depending on the age of the map. Most commonly, the LIMWA is shown as a solid black line with triangle-shaped accents along it. The leftmost map shows an example of the LIMWA displayed on FEMA's National Flood Hazard Layer web viewer, and on the center map, the LIMWA is displayed on a flood insurance rate map. On the rightmost map, the LIMWA is represented on a different flood insurance rate map as a red and black segmented line.
I hope you guys are starring that if you're taking notes, because anybody who misses that on the CFM exam, I don't know what I'm going to do with you, but that will be on your exam. I guarantee it, that little black line with the arrows. So know what that means.
On Flood County Firm Panel 40, a portion of which is shown here, there are special flood hazard areas along the shoreline. These are coastal high hazard areas. Structures in these coastal high hazard areas, mapped as Zone VE or V, are subject to stricter building requirements because of the higher risk of damage from storm surge and wave action. This map panel shows the Atlantic Ocean coastline with Zone VE and Coastal Zone AE areas. Recall that the boundaries dividing flood zones and areas of differing BFEs are shown as solid white lines. Numbered coastal transects are located along the coastline and are oriented perpendicular to the shore. Use the transects to orient to particular locations and find the corresponding information in the FIS, similar to using the lettered cross-sections in riverine areas. Just as the riverine cross-sections mapped on the firm have corresponding information in the FIS, these coastal transects also have detailed corresponding information in the FIS. Some maps have the coastal transects printed on the firm, and some will have the locations in a transect location map in the FIS. The solid and broken diagonal lines in the lower right corner are not for riverine floodways. This crosshatching indicates the area is part of the Coastal Barrier Resources System. Recall that these are called COBRA zones. Newer maps will not display these areas, but this information can still be found online in the National Flood Hazard Layer, or NFHL.
Star those Cobra areas. They will ask you some questions. And Tracy, correct me if I'm wrong, but those are barrier areas that they can't get flood insurance for any structures. You're kind of not supposed to build in them. And if you build recently, you can't get flood insurance, right, Trace?
Correct.
Okay. And you probably won't find that in the mapping section on the test. That'll just be one of your general knowledge questions on the test.
Here's a quick question to help you check your understanding of what you've learned so far about flooding in coastal areas. Select each item below that is true for coastal transects. More than one answer may be correct.
Tell me which box you want me to check, guys. Do they indicate a distance from a river? Yes or no? These are easy to come off mute.
No.
No. Do they connect more details shown in the FIS, your flood insurance study?
Yeah.
Yes. Do they indicate locations where the wave heights are analyzed? For sure.
Yeah.
There you go.
In areas with a coastal flood study, the FIS will contain a section about the models and data used to determine base flood elevations and wave heights. FEMA uses standard storm surge models to simulate a large number of storms and determine storm surge behavior. Coastal topography and bathymetry, or underwater topography, are then used to determine wave heights and BFEs. You can find information about the coastal transects in the figures and tables. Let's review the transect location map, the transect description table, and the transect data table. Shown here is a transect location map from the FIS. This map shows 3 locations along the coastline that were studied. Each location, or transect, is a cross-section from a point off the shoreline to a point inland. Where barrier islands exist, a transect will run from offshore, across the barrier island, across the bay, and onto the mainland. Transect lines run parallel to the flow. Note that these coastal transects are labeled with numbers, unlike riverine cross-sections, which are lettered. On the transect location map, you can see 3 numbered transects located along the coastal area and oriented perpendicular to the shoreline. The coastal structure example is next to coastal transect number 3. You can verify this by comparing this transect location map to the location on the firm, much like you would use the map index to key into a particular landmark or intersection. In coastal areas, the whole foot flood elevation is printed on the firm, as shown under each zone label here. Remember that the white lines indicate a change in flood zone or change in the BFE. As the flood waters move onshore, you can see the base flood elevations become lower. Once the modeled breaking wave is less than 3 feet high, the zone changes from VE to AE. These coastal AE zones are still subject to more wind and wave action than AE zones along rivers. The whole foot BFE for this example is 13 feet. It is important to check the FIS for additional BFE information at these transect locations.
And that might be a question, or that's something you guys need to know, whether it's riverine or it's coastal. What's the BFE of that structure, or the estimate of it? So you guys caught that those white lines are indicating the zones are changing, the elevations are changing. Okay, you got your transects. All these things are going to sound really familiar.
Now that you know the transect number that corresponds to the property in this example, transect 3, go to the transect data tables in the FIS to find more detailed base flood elevation data. The transect data table contains more flood elevation data specifically calculated at each coastal transect. For each coastal flooding source, information for several coastal transects are provided. The columns in the center identify the still water elevation at various flooding frequencies. The columns on the far right identify the flood zone and the base flood elevation along the transect. The structure in this example is near transect 3 and in a VE zone, so you should use the transect data table to find the BFE. The base flood elevations column at the far right shows a range of BFEs for VE zones here. This matches the information on the firm, showing the VE zones of elevation 14, 13, and 12 feet. The most detailed information that can be found in this particular FIS shows the same BFE as the firm, so you can use the number printed on the firm. The BFE location of this structure is 13 feet. While it is appropriate to use 13 as the BFE for an elevation certificate or when issuing a permit, remember that these numbers are rounded to the nearest whole foot. So this 13 may actually represent 12.6, or it may represent 13.4 feet. To account for this rounding and provide additional protection to permitted structures, a recommended best practice is to add 0.4 foot as a safety factor in VE zones where more detail is not found in the FIS. Okay, here are 2 quick questions to help you see how well you understand what you've learned so far about coastal area flood zones. Zone VE indicates coastal areas that have at least a 1% annual chance of being flooded, with wave heights of more than how many feet?
How many feet, guys?
3.
A lot of people are saying 3.
Perfect. Moving on.
Where in the FIS can you find information about the BFEs along a coastal transect?
What do we got, Tracy?
Transect data table.
Yep, thanks, John.
The
Oops. Try again.
transect data table.
See how that works, guys?
Go, Gary.
Going through there, okay?
In this subtopic, you've taken a close look at determining BFE in coastal flood zones. You've learned about the characteristics of wave height, wave setup, and wave run-up. You've learned about coastal transects and how they are similar in many ways to riverine cross-sections, and how, like with riverine cross-sections, a coastal transect on a firm indicates that there is more information in the flood insurance study. You've looked at the LEMWA, the distinction among coastal zones AE, A, and VE, the relative flood risk associated with each, and I've touched on how this affects building codes and standards in a coastal area. And you learned about using the transect location map, the transect description table, and the transect data table in the FIS to determine the BFE for a property based on its proximity to a coastal transect. This concludes the subtopic, finding base flood elevation in coastal flood zones.
Any questions, guys? Okay, that's a lot to throw at you. It's really going to benefit you if you're taking the CFM. And if you're not taking the CFM, at least it gives you an idea of what you should be knowing if you're dealing with riverine flooding in your areas. And it gives you a good idea of like what that FIS looks like. And you can go find that information there. Okay, what I want to do now is I'm going to stop us there. There's more info, but you guys can watch that on your own. And just remember, you go out to the NFIP 101. If you don't have your CFM, don't take it for credit unless you're going to get credit someplace else. Because if you do get your CFM, they're not going to count it because they're going to say you didn't have your CFM yet. the nice thing about taking it just for the study is you can go back and forth, you know, and hit the areas that you feel you need more studying or information in, more practice is, I guess, what I'm trying to say. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I want to take you out to the video that our friends in South Carolina did for us. And they're going to really show you some examples of houses on piers and what this coastal damage can do. Okay, let me find the video. I had it keyed up, Tracy. Where'd it go? Let's see, Tracy. Excuse me. This is a great time to run to the bathroom if you need to. Trace, where'd I put it? Let me close this because we don't need this. It's here, I promise. Well, let me just pull it up again. It's fine. Sorry, guys. Okay. Can you see it, Trace?
Not yet. Nope.
Okay.
And you're going to want to share that sound too.
Yep. That's weird because when I go to pull it up here, I can't find it on select that window. That's what's happening.
You might just have to pull it up on your screen and then share that screen.
Well, that's what I did, and it's not showing it when I say share the screen.
Okay.
Where'd it go? Oh, wait, never mind. I found it because I have 2 pictures of you up. Okay. It's going to share the sound. Here we go. Everybody can see it.
Yep, looks good.
There's a picture of Tracy, and then I kind of know where I want to take us from. So let me just set you guys up here. This is Maria Cox and her group. Maria has the same job as Tracy. She's the NFIP coordinator for South Carolina. We've worked with them a lot. They actually came to Montana years ago, and they put on, you know, some trainings for Tracy, in-person trainings. And when we had our big flood event in June of 2022, we needed extra help. And her crew came in. Is Stephanie online? Like, Stephanie probably met these gals in person if she's online today. Stephanie from Stillwater. So without further ado, I give you Maria and her gals from South Carolina, and they're going to show you some actual flood damage.
1.5 feet and 3 feet, there's still damage that occurs. Waves like to rip things apart. You'll see some pictures here in a minute. So there's a distinction. There's no FEMA regulations for that. Local governments have to adopt those regulations, and they can get CRS credit for that. And we have recommended language for enforcement. Think of it like you've probably heard the term coastal AE zone or coastal A zone. That's what FEMA is trying to establish without creating a new zone or opening regulations up. And then you get your regular AE where your wave height's below 1.5 feet. And then eventually if it drops down, it'll go down to your X zone. It is scary here in some areas. You can have oceanfront property that's an X zone. It actually, in a lot of the Myrtle Beach area, it actually is that way. Most people have heard of Myrtle Beach. It is the bane of our existence at the state level. High population, high development, and very little regulation. It's a nightmare for coastal. A little information, just quickly, we have 5 million people live in this state, and the majority of them live at the coast. So that's where the majority of our policies are as well. So, Erin, anything to add? Mine was a quick and dirty.
Yeah, so just about the LIMWAs. So like Maria said, that's a non-regulatory feature. So FEMA requires that we delineate it for new studies to differentiate between those two wave heights of 1.5 feet or above or below. But those are actually, that's only relevant to building codes and standards. Independent municipalities determine whether or not they adopt those standards in their building codes. So for any municipality or county government or state government for that matter, if they adopt limo regulations into their building codes, what that means is people who build in what are called coastal A zones or areas that are AE but have a wave height greater than 1.5 feet, that means they have to build according to these zone standards. So it's as if they're in a high hazard flood zone. And I think that's about the only thing I'd add.
Okay. Yeah. And we have a lot of communities, so y'all know, that already have this standard, like in their AE zones at the coast, they're enforcing these zone standards already. So it's not a huge shift for a lot of ours, and they've done it all through their flood ordinance in doing that. Like Aaron said, they can do it through building code or flood ordinance, either way. See if I can get my computer to cooperate.
See, she was having problems too. It's not just
doing something. Okay, here we go. There we go. Y'all asked about the lowest horizontal member. This was the best picture I could find. Sorry, it was from a cab. But think about anything that's kind of at the, typically they're at the top of your pilings after you drive your piles. That's where your lowest horizontal member is. So something in the realm of one of these is going to be your lowest horizontal member. And it just, we do have to tell a lot of communities to be careful how they build their stairs and how they attach them. Stairs are usually one of the first things, stairs and decks. It's either they're still standing and the house is gone after a hurricane, or the stairs and the deck are gone and the house is still there. It's one or the other. So a lot of communities have gone to making their decks and access stairs to be structurally independent from their actual main structures. They have a tendency to actually survive the storm better that way. So does this make a little more sense?
No, Maria, I'm glad you mentioned that, because we talk about that too. And even in the riverine flooding, about making those, they're separate. I'm glad you actually mentioned that for Brent and Anthony, for that understanding, because they found the same thing here, not to make it attached to that main structure.
Right.
So I'm glad you guys, because there's nothing really in the regulations about that.
No. And we have it a lot in our riverine areas as well. The other thing is if your deck is not attached to your main structure or structurally independent, it's not part of your substantial damage or substantial improvement calculation. So it can help some people that are trying to stay just under that limit. You know, we don't want to help them too much, but if it's really justifiable, you know, it can help somebody. You let them go where you can. So hopefully that's just a little more visual for you guys about what it kind of looks like without an enclosure below, because 90% of the time people put an enclosure below these elevated buildings, even though we'll show you why they shouldn't here in a minute.
Guys, I just want to emphasize something here. They're talking about that lowest horizontal member, like what you measure to. And in riverine flooding, it's a little bit different. And so the way I had to think about that is, you know, with these coastal areas, they're looking at that lower one, and it's different for riverine. So just be aware of that.
Anybody have any questions on the lowest horizontal member? It is different than the lowest floor. You know, normally the top of the bottom floor is your AE zone, your lowest horizontal member. This also helps keep most of the utilities up a little higher as well, because this bottom half down here, even if you don't reach, in a storm event, you don't reach the base flood elevation, the waves can be knocking on the bottom of this constantly, which we've seen recently, and just tearing up whatever's below here. Even though it's not technically reaching it, but if the waves are pushing high enough, it can do some damage. So, okay.
Thanks, Maria.
So these are breakaway walls. I was very proud of y'all for asking if breakaway walls are hard to enforce, because yeah, they're hard. So these are typical what you see for breakaway walls. These are also trying to meet the insurance requirement of being 40% open so that they can technically not be considered an enclosure. So they make them look more slatted, louvered. If you read the technical bulletin with that, they can't be greater than an inch. They have to be 40% open. There's a lot of requirements for that. These being garage doors, another thing everybody has to be careful of is the type of garage door openers that are placed on them, that they're not reinforced, because remember, these are supposed to break away. So you got to make sure that garage doors, if they're going to automatically open, that unit doesn't prevent it from breaking away. So yeah, so I said hard to regulate, yes. These are the utilities attached to a breakaway wall. This is a no-no, because what's it going to do? It's going to stay there. It's going to hang on for dear life in a storm and either rip the utilities out of the house or not break away at all, which is entirely possible. So this is a no-no. This is not how you're supposed to do it. Y'all really challenged me to go back to some of my pictures from calves to find where people had done violations and had to note it.
Hey, Montana crew, and maybe even possibly Utah crew, I don't want you guys to fall asleep in these sections, because just yesterday in one of our Montana towns, we're helping them with a property owner who looks like he has to build his triplex on piers. He doesn't want to bring in that much fill, and it's going to be cheaper for him to build on piers. So don't fall asleep with these pictures, because, you know, these might be things you have to deal with also, or you'll have at least an idea of where do they put those utilities underneath.
Hey, Shylea.
My favorite one, this is actually underneath.
Yeah, Trace.
Sorry, Gary had a question concerning the lowest horizontal member, and I just wanted to kind of clarify. In riverine situations, kind of like Shylea mentioned just a little bit earlier, Gary, we would look at, like, if somebody had to do that 2 foot of freeboard, we'd look at the top of the floor, but in the V zones, they would look to make sure that that lowest horizontal member is actually 2 feet above that base flood elevation. That's the way I kind of think about that. So I just wanted to throw that out there for you.
Thanks, Trace, for that clarification. So just know, in a V zone, you're looking at the lowest horizontal member, but in an AE zone, you're looking at the other one. Say it for me, Trace.
The top floor. Thanks.
Top floor. Thank you.
The house, from the outside, it was just solid breakaway walls. Yeah, they had consolidated 2 houses and decided to put floor to ceiling shelving and everything you would not want in a storage unit, well, in a enclosure below, was in this one. So you can kind of tell the shelving goes around the pilings and everything. So they had to modify this, fix it. The floodplain manager was mortified when we walked in, because of course the lady didn't know any better and she invited us in. So we got to go see it firsthand. So it happens. But they were able to do some retrofitting to actually keep the shelving. The shelving being on the breakaway walls doesn't necessarily make it where it won't break away, but the shelving attached to the pilings is the bigger problem. So they were able to retrofit it, get an engineer to certify it, and were able to fix their violation.
Nice.
Wanted to show you some storm pictures here. This is kind of what happens. There were enclosures below these 2 buildings. You notice they put more of a hard face door and probably tried to reinforce that, and therefore that part's still standing. This will also go into when we talk about erosion in a minute. But over here, there's actually utilities and actually some shelving that are what's keeping this actual wall from breaking away. So sorry, these were taken for substantial damage assessments, not for, so I wasn't super close when I took these photos. But pay attention to the painted pilings, and then all of a sudden they're not painted anymore. We'll bring that up again here in a minute. But it's very fascinating, some of the stuff that happens at the coast. But this was Hurricane Matthew that came ashore in South Carolina. Everything likes to come ashore in McClellanville, South Carolina. It sticks out just a little bit, and then it'll clip McClellanville, and then it actually comes in the PD region. These are actually a little farther south than that. This is Edisto Beach, but they took a lot of damage in Hurricane Matthew, and again in, I think it was Irma, they took some more damage. We'll show you what happened here in a second. So notice the swings, notice once again some more pilings. And this was the slab underneath the elevated building. So that was their parking slab. This is why you see in the coastal construction manual, which y'all may or may not decide to read in your lifetime being in Montana, but why it says you're not supposed to attach the slab to the foundation, because it will take a house down. They're lucky this house is still standing, that it actually broke away the way it was supposed to, except for where it's attached to the piling. Shouldn't still look like that, but it gives way, especially when you have a severe erosion issue. Notice there's no stairs. The stairs back here are hanging on by a thread, but it also, you kind of hard to see in here, but right here is what I mean by like the waves are barely hitting the bottom and it's ripping off the stuff underneath the house. So you just never know how high the waves might actually, how high that wind's going to drive those waves up. You can have a much smaller storm do some pretty significant damage. So you might want to ask, you can kind of see in the back, but where did all the sand go? It went on Palmetto Boulevard. This is right behind it. I was actually driving on Palmetto Boulevard for Shay, that's the National Guard, out there, South Carolina National Guard, scooping up sand that is literally 5 to 6 feet deep down Palmetto Boulevard. It's still Edisto Beach. So this is their main drag through town. So on the left-hand side of the photo is the first row of houses, and then it's across the street. So you can see the other thing that happened when we got out there and started looking at it, a lot of the sand from the dunes, the ocean front, the beach, pushed into the houses on the second row. So the sand was actually on the, if they had a first floor, it was down there or it was underneath their homes, and it could be 3-4 feet deep under there. Aaron, do you want to add why this occurs?
Well, so there's I mean, as you can imagine, erosion obviously is a big part of it, but there's also a thing that happens called overtopping, and you can probably guess overtopping, even when the storm surge isn't high enough to get over, let's say, dunes or something. Like if you picture those big giant sand dunes in North Carolina, the surge may not be high enough to get over those dunes, but the waves and wave setup actually cause that water to slosh up on the dunes and wash that sand backwards. And if you're in something like a barrier island where you have a back marsh, on the island where you're trying to maintain sediment, that's not a big deal for that marsh. That marsh is used to it. But when you build back behind these dunes and there's no more marsh, all of that sand then just washes out into the streets, starts to wash away foundations, and anywhere the water can get, the sand will get. So as long as you have water to carry sand, that's where that sand will go. And inevitably, in a place like this, Edisto, I think it's Edisto or Kiowa Island, which is in the southern part of South Carolina, there are relatively small storm events where they have all of their dunes wash over onto the road behind the beach on a regular basis, and they don't even have to use beach nourishment. They just take the bulldozers out there and push the sand back out on the beach. That's a fairly normal occurrence for them, and it's because you built the road right there on the beach.
Yeah, not the best choice.
And the Montana version of this, or the Utah riverine version of this, is, all the debris that comes down in our flooding events, which were a major issue in June 2022. How to get that debris out. Keep in mind too, all those people walking in your offices and saying, it's never flooded where I live. it won't flood where I live. All it takes is one big tree to get stuck on a rock and then some debris to pile up and make a dam and divert that water. And we saw a lot of that happen in June of 2022. So I hope as you guys are sitting here watching this and thinking about sand, where it's February, we'd all like to be on a beach somewhere, right? You're also thinking about how these things could occur in your community in real life, so to speak, for you guys, because we've got spring coming, we're getting snow. We might have a little runoff this year.
Erin, you kind of got to a question I had when you said they pushed the sand back out onto the beach. I was wondering, like, where they're legally allowed to put all this sand when they're taking it off the street. Can they just go and put it back under the house that it had eroded out from underneath, or are there regulations about dune recovery?
It depends on where you are. So Maria kind of alluded to this to begin with. So some states are very, very particular, like North Carolina is a CTV. They are very particular about the kinds of things that you can and can't do to the beach and the dunes. Those are highly regulated, highly protected areas. And so they're really, for lack of a better term, they're really anal about the way that they regulate what you can do. So in a place like Edisto Beach or Kiowa, yeah, I mean, since they know that the sand literally just came from right there, they'll just push it back out. In most instances, I would say yes. They will relocate the sand back out onto the beach. Some municipalities have their own plans as to, do they collect the sand and then evenly redistribute it where it needs to go? This is why a lot of the communities are required to have post-storm recovery plans. They're supposed to plan for things like this, like how they're going to collect the sand after a storm, where is it going to go? Do they have emergency plans for dune replenishment or dune reconstruction? And some communities do and some communities don't. And that's unfortunately the best answer.
I can tell you specifically what happened here, Shay, so you know specifically with Edisto Beach. The National Guard, there was a big debate because Edisto Beach has septic oceanfront and they have sewer everywhere else. So there was some concern about contamination because we found plenty of uncovered septic fields and septic tanks. So the National Guard, rather than getting in a debate with our Department of Health and Environmental Control, pushed it to the side of the road, basically blocked anybody's ability to get anywhere. It was great. The road was clear, but you couldn't access your driveway. And then left it up to the town to deal with it from there. And the town just decided to push it back on the beach and put it back under people's houses. And then a year later, the same thing happened. It ended up back again, and they did the exact same thing. The National Guard pushed it to the side, and the town took care of it from there and put it back under. Their opinion was it came from there. They had wanted it to be decontaminated and all this stuff to be done to it. And the town was like, we can't afford that. We're putting it back on the beach. Because they literally had maybe 5 feet that you could walk in front of people's houses before you were in the high tide line of the water. They had lost, that's all of Edisto's Beach and the dunes on Palmetto Boulevard. So I don't know what they did about getting it out. I'd have to ask Patrick Brown, the floodplain manager there, how they got it out of the people's houses. I mean, how the people took care of that, because that was quite a feat. But a lot of pre-firm structures here, so quite a bit of stuff that had enclosures below.
That's awesome.
Does that help?
Maria, I'm sure this is gonna. I'm sure Shay and I are probably gonna have 1,000 questions for you on this because this is so fascinating. So at some point, we'll have to set something up because I'm trying to keep quiet on it because I have a ton of questions on this one. So
we can, and I'm sure this may spark more questions. And if y'all have questions after this is over, and y'all have questions that come up, feel free to contact and we'll get you some answers. Some of it's pretty funny. Like if it happens over and over again, like the local officials are just like, forget it. Myrtle Beach decided after, I think it was Hurricane Dorian, that they just weren't going to put their dunes back. They didn't care anymore. They were done. They were tired of having to deal with it. So they said, ocean will put it back if it wants it. So
Yeah, if
but just kind of not put them back.
Whoa.
Yeah, that kind of affects your mapping, by the way. It's not the best way to handle things if the mapping was done and you had dunes. Aaron will get into that. So here's another one. I thought we'd get into like pile, scour, and then erosion. This is kind of what Aaron was alluding to earlier. This is Hilton Head Island. This was also, I think this was Irma, where their dunes have, as you can tell, had a pretty substantial dune network and had vegetation on it. It held, but it took, I would guess, well, pretty much the front half of the dunes, it took it away. And they actually have a beach nourishment program there that's funded. So it didn't take them too long, and they fixed this. But very good example of how it erodes, like that it's not getting over it necessarily, but it's just, Aaron, would you say just beating the crap out of the dunes through the whole storm and just taking it away, much like a dam and how it'll scour on a dam?
Yeah, this is, and I'll get into this in a little bit in a minute, but this is actually what we would consider a dune retreat case, where the dune has a substantial enough amount of sand that the storm surge isn't getting over the dunes, right? So like we mentioned earlier, but it just sits there and the waves just continuously hit the front of this and just chew the sand away. So this is why healthy dune systems are considered a substantial protection from flood damage. As you can see, I mean, all of the waves are basically hitting the front of this dune, and the dune is basically forcing those waves to break and preventing all of that destructive wave energy from making it into houses. So this is an example of why a healthy dune system is really, really important.
Yeah, and so we're just trying to kind of show you guys kind of some different things that have happened. We have it where it takes up the dunes and deposit it on the street behind them. And then you have some dunes that actually do their job. They look like they've been through, 12 rounds with Mike Tyson, but they held and they did their job. And so this is exactly why you see the signs that tell you not to walk on the dunes. And they have actual walkovers and things like that. So, all right, Aaron's going to be the prime here. But Aaron, you just tell me when you want me to change slides, okay?
Okay, that's good. So obviously, coasts around the U.S. are not the same. So FEMA treats coastal erosion in analyses different depending on where you are. And so we have, these are some screenshots of some of the figures out of the FEMA guidance for coastal erosion. If you want to look up the guidance, which, if you're bored. These are some of the configurations that FEMA will give examples and recommendations on how to treat erosion. And as you can imagine, on the eastern Gulf coasts, primarily what you're going to see are the top two. So we've got some form of dune-backed beach. In Louisiana and Texas and Mississippi, you start to get into some of these coasts that are rimmed by tidal wetlands and mudflats. Up in the Northeast, we've got these erodible bluffs. This is the same on the Pacific coast in a lot of areas. You have these erodible bluffs. And on the very bottom corner, these are not really common, but these occur primarily in the Northeast, in New England, are these formations. We call them coastal banks, more or less, and what they are leftover glacial material that form kind of erodible but not erodible coastal feature that's kind of more armored than a dune naturally. And so you can imagine how all of these different features are going to erode differently. So we have to, when we do a coastal study, we have to consider what our settings are and how likely the coast is to respond to a storm in the event of heavy erosion. So this is kind of a snapshot of how all these areas are considered, because obviously they're all unique and they don't erode the same way. So go ahead, Maria. So in our...
Guys, for the sake of time, since we're 5 minutes till the end of class, I'm going to go ahead and stop this video. But I think they gave us some really good things to think about, especially when they were talking about the sand and the sand removal and the disaster. hopefully that got you guys thinking about, oh my gosh, contaminated septics. Telling people to stay out of the floodwaters would probably be a good idea in light of that. What about the water going into people's ground wells? Because we have a lot of that here. So now we have contaminated water and dealing with that for folks. These erosion issues for us, you know, a lot of stream bank. You guys saw the pictures of June 2022 floods and, you know, the houses hanging over, falling in the river really close. Those are things that you guys are going to deal with as floodplain managers. So as we wrap up today's class on coastal, I think we gave you a really good taste of the VE zones, the coastal, the LIMWAs, all that kind of stuff. And then she did a great job of showing you that lowest floor elevation and how they measure that in a VE and how that's different than an AE. So those are going to be really key takeaways when you guys go and take your CFM exam or just help you guys do your jobs better. Any questions? Okay. Tracy, I don't see anything coming in the chat. Do you?
No, we were trying to answer them as they came in, so I think you're good.
Great. So a couple of things from me. Next week, you're going to have me teaching again. And hopefully you guys notice my style is a little bit, I like applied, but I also like the technical stuff. But I'd like you to be able to take that technical information and apply it. So we're going to be talking about chapter 2 in the FEMA 480 book. We're going to be talking about the flood insurance program and some more basics of the NFIP, the National Flood Insurance Program, which your communities are all participating in. So a little bit more back to basics. This stuff on coastal mapping wraps up like the whole month of mapping that we went through, that Perry and Mark took you guys through. And if you go to the NFIP 101 and go all the way through that chapter 3, which I think you need about 3 hours to do to get through it all, you guys should have a really good chance of doing well on the mapping section. Plus, on February 27th, you guys have that opportunity to go live and in person and train with Tracy. The morning of the 27th, she is going to do basic floodplain. And then that afternoon, she's going to get into intermediate permitting and really help you guys with how to process permits and what you need to do. So we've been sending out that information. And then last but not least, you will see I sent you out the February schedule with your Zoom invites. Notice on the February 22nd class, we're trying something a little bit experimental. We're asking you to register to take that class, because if it works and it goes well and you give us good, decent feedback, that might be how we do things, so that then we don't have to take attendance by hand. And if you remember in the beginning, I was after you all to enter your information. We'll just have it collected in advance. Tracy, what do you want to add for these guys?
No, I think you hit on everything. Just a reminder for next week, I think you're going to continue a little bit of the coastal and then get into unit 2. Is that correct, Shylea?
I'll look through it and see, you know, and you and I can talk about what you want these guys to know that's still here in this coastal. We may start with a little bit of review for those who weren't with us, and we may continue some of this video that South Carolina did. So we'll look through it.
No, good job. Thank you, Shylea. I think it's good to see where to find a lot of this information, the FEMA 480, the online Floodplain 101 course that they put a lot of thought into when they put that together. It's been super helpful. And then from our partners in South Carolina, it really does help kind of tie everything in as you're seeing it in the kind of real world scenarios. So I really, appreciate your approach to this, and hopefully everybody found it helpful. And kind of it's kind of easier to visualize kind of what FEMA 480 was talking about when we're dealing with coastal areas. And like Shylea opened up and mentioned about Utah having those coastal areas. We know I personally, when I used to work as a floodplain ranger for Flathead County, we had really pushed to try to get Flathead Lake designated as a coastal area because of the wave run-ups. And there's a lot of information on that from the Yellow Bay Biological Station. They actually, one of their biologists years ago had done a wave run-up study for Flathead Lake, and it was amazing. We did have quite a few structures that got flooded out because of the wave run-up. And so I even though Utah has it, I wouldn't doubt that we will start seeing a coastal zone here, especially in Flathead Lake, probably in the next 10 to 20 years. So it'll be interesting to talk with our Utah folks about kind of how they're handling their coastal zones. And when we see them at the Association of State Floodplain Managers Conference, the annual conference is going to be here in Region 8 in Salt Lake, Utah. If you haven't registered, I highly encourage you to register and start making those connections. Utah and Montana have a lot of similar kind of landscapes and a lot of similar issues when it comes to floodplain management. So I know we're talking about the Association of Montana Floodplain Managers Conference coming up at the end of this month, but in June, please look into the ASFPM conference. Our folks from Utah, McKinsey, and Tom, all those guys are involved in putting that conference together. So we encourage you guys to do that. And that's all I had, Shylea.
Excellent. Okay, go forth and conquer, stay high and dry, and have a great weekend, guys.